On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for this virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival presentation. This program is Pop Culture, from Zorro to Speedy Gonzales and beyond, with Stephen Andes and Rodneyna Hart. Stephen J.C. Andes is an associate professor of history at Louisiana State University. He is the author of 3 books of nonfiction, including his most recent work, Zorro's Shadow: How a Mexican Legend Became America's First Superhero. It was named among the best non-Western and POC fantasy books of 2020 by Den of Geek, and included in the Chicago Tribune's 12 must-reads of fall 2020. He lives with his wife and 3 kids in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Rodneyna M.O. Hart has been instrumental in the development of art and cultural advancements in Louisiana for over 15 years. She now serves as Division Director for the Louisiana State Museum, overseeing the 4 regional state museums. Hart creates environments that strategically meet the needs of the communities they serve through programming, promotion, partnerships, dialogue, and exhibitions. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Andes and Rodneyna Hart.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
Good to see you, Rodneyna.
Great to see you. It's great to talk again. It's been a minute.
I know, right? We had like a few things going on, I guess, this last year and a half. So I was recently hearing about this sense of like people referring to, pre-pandemic as before times.
The before times. The before 4.
Yeah, that's right. So we haven't really talked since the before times. So it's good to.
Well, I'm happy that we can now. So let's get into it. We're talking a little bit about popular culture. We're talking about Zorro. We're talking about not Mighty Mouse. I keep trying to call him Mighty Mouse.
Speedy Gonzales.
Speedy Gonzales. And maybe a little bit about some of the things that you've written in the past. But let's start off, who are you? Who are you? How do you identify? Because that plays a lot in the opposite of the things that you are talking about.
Right. Good question. Yeah, I guess, I identify as a white, cisgendered heterosexual man. I'm married to a woman. We have 3 kids. Pretty much, you're sort of generic cookie cutter, right? And stuff like that. So, but yeah.
And yet, most of your writing and your research and your life has been devoted to Latinx culture. Why so?
That's a great question. I think, the story is basically I grew up in a Protestant household, and my first experiences with Mexico were, again, another stereotype of a missionary sort of endeavor. We drove across the Mexican border, helped a church build, a church in Mexico build a building that they could have as their church building. And I was 13 years old. That was my first experience in Mexico. And I learned Spanish in high school and stuff like that. But then I actually lived in Mexico when I was 20 years old for a year, again, in sort of like a missionary capacity, as, sort of lived at a church. Nobody else really spoke English, had to learn Spanish really well, was sort of immersed in that culture. And that year sort of exploded my brain, right? All my sort of earlier expectations of what it looks like of, cross-culturally just, and I was forever changed after that. And sort of it sent me on the course of academics, getting a PhD in history. And
you wrote a book about the mysterious Sophia.
Yeah.
Who is she and why is she significant?
So this woman, Sophia del Valle, is sort of in some ways, she's kind of like the the Mexican Mother Teresa, although there's many differences in that she wasn't a nun, but she sort of devoted her life to service of the Catholic Church, and she went everywhere. She knew everybody. She went to the United States, she went to Europe, she knew popes, but yet her story was essentially forgotten, was, really not told. And so I wanted to tell the story of this woman who um, who deserved, a biography of her life, but doesn't have the same sort of like name recognition as, you know certain people in history and stuff like that. And so it was sort of unearthing this story that was powerful, that was meaningful, especially for the Catholic Church, the maintenance of the Catholic Church over the course of the 20th century, but her story hadn't been told.
So do you encourage other people to go over and have those kinds of experiences? And do you think that it's been informed a lot by religion and proselytizing?
Good question. Uh, I think, over time, I think my ideas about mission and proselytizing and stuff like that have changed. But I think what's interesting about that experience is that I'm sure, and as a historian, that we could give you, 10 different versions of how that kind of experience went horribly wrong. Um, right. But at the same time, for me, the experience itself, I think, had um, a kind of emergent property that 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 you know changed who I am, right? And so, on one hand, it's like, you know, I know all of the sort of racial power dynamics that go into that kind of endeavor, but on the other hand, um, it's hard to deny like how that experience can actually change somebody's vision about the world and their perspective on it and how they might grasp that world out there, right?
So for your children, would you encourage them to have an immersive experience, and would it be filtered through the same lens that you had?
There would have to be some boundaries around it. I think, um, if I wasn't involved in that trip, I would definitely need to trust the people that were leading a kind of trip like that.
Mhm.
And also, what I would be very much into is a kind of more of a cross cultural exchange, right? So it's not just uh, if they were a part of a church in Baton Rouge going down to Mexico, say, but that there would be a reciprocal kind of exchange of,
Yeah.
people from that target country coming to the United States and spending time here and
So
vice
it's
versa.
a lot more of an equitable
Yeah.
cultural exchange.
Yeah.
So something I think about whenever I think about religion is the evangelical sin of racism,
Right.
and something that kind of embodies this past racism and the way that things are filtered. Um, for me, that has a direct tie into how I got into popular culture and nerd culture in general, is understanding like X-Men, direct allegory for being othered, for racism. How about you? Was your what was your entry into popular culture and understanding these kinds of larger than life, almost mythical individuals as part of something that you felt was a part of you?
Yeah. Yeah, I think about my early experiences. I think more than comic books for me, it was early television. Saturday mornings and stuff like that.
What'd you watch?
And I watched. I was, it's sort of embarrassing, but I was a huge like GI Joe fan, Transformers, uh, you know, uh, and then when I got a little older, the sort of Disney afternoon, the Batman, DuckTales, all those kind
Yeah,
of things.
I mean those
Uh,
were old. Yeah. There's nothing to be embarrassed about that. That's awesome.
But yeah. So I mean, I think I saw like I I think that there was something larger than life, a story that you could kind of enact and play act. I was always a kid that, like, let's say Star Wars was on the movies. I always had to have like all the gear that I had that was Star Wars like set up around me, right? Or
Okay.
if like Indiana Jones was on, I had to have like some sort of fedora like hat on,
So do
as
you
I was
think that
watching.
that has some tie with your immersion in Mexican culture, and then having these experiences with, say, Zorro, and then you have this immersive experience that you create, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
I mean, it seems like that's kind of key
yeah,
to your
yes. No,
personality.
I agree, but what I sort of push back on is like,
Mhm.
am I like cosplaying like other cultures or something,
Mm,
like, and that because like my current work on like Speedy Gonzales deals a lot with this sense of like the way that American culture, like one of its basics, sort of pop culture forms is blackface minstrelsy, and how that sort of pervades American culture and even Speedy Gonzales, right? Like,
absolutely.
um,
I mean,
and
he was voiced by a white actor, a voice actor, in the same way that Zorro had been played by Italian actors.
right,
Yeah, it's definitely a parallel, but also it's what is the difference between um, cosplay of a character and a caricature
mm,
of a culture.
yeah, yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense of um, when we talk about cosplay, I think a lot of times it is within the realm of, or within the context of fandoms, right? Um, and so there is probably like a sense of veneration that comes towards that character, right? Like I want to dress up like this character because I there's a love for that, right? Whereas usually I think when we think about stereotypes and caricatures, there's a sense of derisiveness to it, or like a one up, one down kind of punching down on a group, right?
Mhm.
That's kind of what immediately comes to my mind. So yeah, no, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is like, I don't, hopefully, I think I have the best intentions, right? But at the same time, it's like, I think for me, a lot of pop culture and a lot of this work has been one that is trying to look at myself, right? As like in my subjectivity, in my position, and say, like, how do I benefit from this? How have I taken part in in a kind of popular culture that um, is oftentimes has been made for me and people that look like me.
Mhm.
Um, and what is the responsibility and the duty that I have um, to look for something deeper or better,
Yeah.
Um,
You know what it makes me think about is that song by the Afro Cocoa Puffs, Hinata Isn't Black.
mm,
And it's like, oh, she gonna be black today.
right.
Yeah. And it's a celebration of this character. There's no white face or yellow face or whatever that the character, that the singer embodies, but they are embodying the cosplay. They are the character that day. And that's definitely, it's a balance. It's an understanding and an appreciation of the character, but it also is a celebration of the joy that's derived from, from nerddom, from the strength and the interest of that character. And it's not a racial thing, it's not a gendered thing. It is just pure understanding of appreciation that this this character, that this personage exists in some way. And that's really a thing that in general nerddom that you can absolutely enjoy, I guess. There is all of the nuance. There's all of the understanding, the history of blackface, of costuming as a culture, of pretty much all of the problematic things that it could embody. But there's something about going to a con and seeing, the creativity of costuming and the way that people are embodying these larger than life, fictional characters that you understand exactly where they're coming from and why they're doing it.
Mhm.
And I think the fact that you're bringing in so much history and richer understanding around the characters that you're bringing scholarship to, I think that explains where you are in this dynamic and how you immerse yourself in this world without taking ownership of it. Like the way that you write, it explains without feeling that you are the owner of the history.
Mhm.
And I think that is really important. Like I feel that you are giving light and elevating the voices of the minorities that you are writing about, um, but it's not as the white man authority, but as the person who has this platform that you're now sharing and giving light to a story that had been overlooked. So I think that that's a really important distinction, and it's something that I try to do also in my museums is that I try to elevate the lived experiences of the people that we're highlighting. We had a Cislanders exhibition, and it was the descendants of the Canary Islanders who had come to Louisiana. And the person who curated that exhibition is a Canary Islander. She was able to speak from a firsthand narrative and explain why we all need to know about Louisiana's history in a very culturally authentic way. And it's a delicate balance, but I think you're doing well. I think that you are able to kind of toe that line and still bring the kind of scholarship that's necessary to have a greater understanding of this story. And it's something that everyone can get into. But
Thank you.
let's go back to speaking specifically about these characters. So Mighty Mouse, I want to talk about because you're around here saying that that Speedy Gonzales is the fastest mouse, and I'm just saying.
That's good. I didn't even think about that. I was like, oh man, I'm gonna have to prove that in my book. Um,
Yeah, this is. I mean, like I watched a lot of Nick at Night and any of the classic like cartoons that they would show sometimes, and I was like Team Mighty Mouse, but I know that like Speedy is the fastest in Mexico, in all of Mexico.
that's true. That's true.
Yeah, that's not what you said.
I did say America's fastest mouse.
Yeah, you did.
Um, dang it. I think I was trying to be clever in the sense of, obviously Speedy is a Mexican mouse, but at the same time, like he was very much made for an American audience.
Mhm.
But yeah. However, there is a comic, an interesting comic that has a foot race between Roadrunner and Speedy Gonzales. That it's anybody's bet who's going to win that. But
I don't know. Roadrunner is just a fast bird, but like we're still talking about mouse too. Yeah.
that's right. Okay, all right. I'm going to have to look more into to Mighty Mouse.
Okay.
But but for me, you know, his Mighty Mouse also has his strength. So there's a little bit of that.
There is. But I do like the understanding of America and not just saying like Central, South, North America, but America,
Yeah.
just at all in general, and a broader understanding of the fastest mouse in all of Mexico also being American
Hmm.
in a sense.
Yeah.
Yes, created for American audiences. And I think that there is a certain amount of nuance that's happening more contemporarily in the depictions of Speedy Gonzales. That he, like in the new movie, the way that he was depicted. You want to talk about just kind of the differences
Yeah.
that were, yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, one, I loved the new Space Jam movie. I thought, uh, for whatever reason, there was definitely a sense of nostalgia. I had my kids with me. It just there was something about it that felt good. But at the same time, I was both happy about how they portrayed Speedy Gonzales, but also a little disappointed.
Yeah.
Um, I was happy in that uh, one of the things they did was when Speedy had lines, few lines, but they oftentimes gave him Spanish, right?
Yes.
Spanish words,
Yeah.
right? And it just felt more right, like it wasn't like the sort of cloying kind of classic accent, right? That Looney Tunes, Mel Blanc, and stuff like that. It was done by Gabriel Iglesias,
Yes.
right? But at the same time, they like barely used him at all.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um,
I mean,
and
it's
I
an
don't,
ensemble cast, so
sure,
you
sure,
can't give like too much space for any of them. Although, if I'm making a sports movie, like he's number one pick.
I know, right?
Yeah, like getting across that court in no time, dude, easy. I mean, yes, scale is a bit of an issue. Might get smushed by the ball, but I mean, maybe some traveling. I don't know.
Yeah,
Those are technical issues that I think with a little practice we can get him to be an A1 player.
I know, right?
Yeah. But yeah, it's important that there was a person of Mexican descent who was able to portray him. That this was not a caricature of a person in the, well, except maybe the outfit, but
Right.
but it's classic and it's the way that this character is depicted. I mean, and there were some other changes that they made within the movie, making Lola Bunny less sexual because that's just weird, and paying more attention to the way that these characters represent broad swaths of people. Because in general, how is Speedy Gonzales seen by Mexican people?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say that for the most part, the people that I've interviewed and talked to, and just anecdotal sort of conversations, are very much like team team Speedy, right? Um, I think he represented a character that, especially in an earlier time when there wasn't much Mexican American or Latinx representation, like he was there, Zorro and Speedy, right? And so there's a sense of like, well, if I'm going to look at all these characters, this this guy is closer to my heritage and you know who I am and so there's a sense of nostalgia there.
Is
Um,
there just an honor in being represented
right.
in some way? And for the most part, yes, full of stereotypes, but relatively positive ones.
Yeah.
The Lothario, who's great with the women, able to beat foes, and just a hero, you know,
Right.
uh, and much smarter than the silly cat.
Right. Right. And
That's
oftentimes the cat, is sort of billed as and even said like the gringo,
yeah,
uh,
The
pussycat,
very American cat, yeah.
So I do think those sense that representation is there, and then as I've sort of begun to scratch the surface, you realize there's some darker stuff in there that I think is worth bringing out into the light, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the narratives that I think that really turned me on to writing about Speedy after I did the Zorro book was a sense of, well, there's every Mexican American I know likes Speedy, and I have this friend that likes him, and so I, as a white consumer, what problem should I have with it, right? As though it's sort of again like putting the onus on a potentially marginalized community to say what racism is without a deeper introspection within culture in general to say like what do we value and how do we value it, right? And not to say that, oh, because I say Speedy is racist, that means like what I say goes for everybody else. I'm not going to tell anybody that
And is he racist because he's Mexican?
Well, I think part of the deal is about that sort of imaginary, right?
Yeah. The whole Twitter feed about this.
I know.
Yeah,
right.
I know you do.
Right. Yeah. It's like, yeah, it's complicated. But I think one of the things to hone in on is the most of the decisions about how a Mexican mouse were portrayed were not done by Mexican Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Even though there were Mexican Americans that I have found, and that's part of what this book is hopefully going to be about, is talking about the story of the Mexican American animators who were actually there at Warner Brothers. But they still had little say about how Speedy was portrayed, right? And so I think in general, that is something that we as a culture have come to say, well, we value stories told by the people that they're being told about, right? And that, Lin-Manuel Miranda and others wrote, no stories about us without us, right? This sort of open letter and stuff like that. And I think that is a great rule of thumb going forward, right? And so, I'm also intrigued about this sense of like how pop culture is ubiquitous now and ever present.
Yes.
And it's devoid of sort of timeline and context, right? Yeah. And so I think both the Zorro thing and this kind of both go into that, is like I'm trying to add some kind of historical view about how these things change over time, right? And because if we don't see them as changing over time, all of a sudden, there's not a lot of smart thinking about how to view the stuff that we do see,
Yeah. And I think we're at a point where we can be dispassionate towards even our popular culture, because we can put it in a historic context. We can understand what were all of these social economic factors that kind of built to us understanding and having these depictions and this understanding. One of the questions that I wrote was, do you think that the allegory of Speedy Gonzales and his cousin Slowpoke Rodriguez represent the duality of Latin representation and stereotypes, and simultaneously are the taking our jobs, super Mexican person who works super diligently, and also the belief of the shiftless, lazy immigrant who is just on the American dole? This is the same kind of stereotype that African Americans had, especially after Reconstruction. But the fact too that Slowpoke Rodriguez carries a weapon, there are a lot of different things that are being said and tied up in this like 60-second cartoon. how do you feel that that speaks to a broader understanding of our racial dynamics?
Yeah. Well, I think number one is this sense of like um, the problem. So, you know, there's a scholar, Charles Ramirez Berg, who I think has really spoken really well about especially Latinx stereotypes and stuff like that. But and I what he says that's so powerful is this sense of um, you know, everybody makes stereotypes, prejudices.
Sure.
You know, though there's a sense of just that's our socialization, culture, whatever. But what makes them go over the line there is when the part or the tendential or the um, the worst characteristics of a person become to represent the whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that has been repeated time and again with um, you know, African Americans, with Latinx people, with Asian Americans, right? Is this sense of you know, he says, sure, there are Mexican bandits, sure, there are lazy you know, XYZ people, but when that specific tendential characteristic comes to represent a whole group of people, right? Then that's when the insidiousness of stereotype begins to be implanted on people, and when those power dynamics happen. And so,
Right. Because
so
as a
yeah,
white person, you can solely represent yourself. You know, this is a
exactly,
one-off. But
exactly.
whenever it's a person of color, or a Black or Indigenous or person of color, they are seen as the whole, as a
Mm-hmm.
representative model. And maybe it's because there's a smaller pool, but I
Mm-hmm.
think it's mostly steeped in racism
Yeah.
and stereotyping, and that is just detrimental to understanding individuals,
Mm-hmm.
which, you know, kind of brings us back to the understanding of where and why popular culture, and especially comic books and things of that nature, are so important to early development, and
Mm-hmm.
understanding that, you know, monsters are people, and that um, our preconceived notions are only that. You know, like we
Right,
can
exactly.
start at stereotype, but we got to grow from that.
Right. And so I think they're like within popular culture, you know, and this is maybe controversial to some, I don't know,
Ooh, give me the controversy.
but well, but I think that I think there is a little bit of active kind of pop cultural reparation that needs to take place in terms of representation,
Hmm.
right? Like that, um, if uh, the sort of status quo has been every time you see a Mexican character who's drunk, right? Um, you know, the next time you put you know, you know, a borracho Mexican character in a comic book or a movie, you need to have had, you know, any number of different kinds of characters before you show that character, or before that character comes within the universe, right? Because, you know, we've seen that character before. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that
Like,
that
oh, you did
character,
that one already.
right,
Got it. Great.
right,
But
okay,
what else are
so
you showing me?
right, exactly. And so, I
Yeah.
mean, I think um you know, that's, I think sometimes why there's that sense of, you know, no stories about us without us, is because a, somebody within that group is perhaps not so interested in just telling that same old story. You know, they're interested in telling the breadth and depth of their experience, right? That
Right.
might not jive with the stereotype, and probably doesn't, right? And so um, I think I think that's what needs to
So
continue to
what would
happen. And
you
you
say would be kind of the opposite, or the more ideal depiction? Like, who gets it right?
Right. Well, so yeah, the reality is that it's not as though, if we look at depictions of cartoon characters in Mexico at the time, they're necessarily getting
And
it
we're
right.
talking 1953.
Right.
Yeah.
So
There's a lot that's happened since then.
right, exactly, right.
Yeah.
I do think that not to dodge your question too much, but that Speedy is different in translation, because again, it's exactly what we were just saying. Speedy gets to be a funny mouse,
Yeah.
right? And not, he is obviously Mexican, but that's not like his chief moniker.
Right. He's got a lot more range than, say, Mickey.
Right. And so, I mean, the drunk, sort of supporting characters in Speedy Gonzales cartoons, well, those are just funny. They're not taken to be the whole. They get to be themselves. They get to be individuals within that culture. And so I think, who gets it right in the 1950s? I don't know. I think there are glimpses of interesting things that take place. I think it's like, let's just take Warner Brothers in general. I think there's some interesting things that that Speedy becomes by the later 60s, where he's no longer, it's just sort of, he kind of becomes more generic, but at the same time, he's, in these situations where it doesn't have to be all about him being a Mexican mouse, right? There's something that he's just sort of one of the cast of characters, etc. But no.
Well, I've got a question that has just, I've questioned it for a while. It's not related to anything, but I've often wondered, why do we have so many positive mouse representations, but then like rats are awful? Like rats are just despicable, and but they're stronger, and like
Right.
they're scarier, maybe. I don't know. Um, why are we so pro mouse and anti rat?
Yeah, I mean, my first knee jerk. This is something that I've begun to try to look into a little bit more. But um, I mean, I think there's obviously an association with rats and disease, right? The plague, right? The sort of carriers of disease and stuff. I mean, in early sort of in literature, you look at like the stories of Beatrix Potter and the way that she writes about, usually it's bunnies or mice, and I think so with that, there's not only the association with rats with disease, but also these characters are oftentimes characters that there's like a relatability with children, right? Because I think some of those stories come out of like children's literature. Sure, Looney Tunes and stuff like that wasn't really made
Also,
for
like Secret of
kids.
Nem,
Right. Yeah, yeah. There's a relatability, like a cuteness, a sort of that maybe rats don't have. But I think,
Yeah,
rats should have a chance too.
I think so too. And then too, I guess, with the way that we perceive cute, the like eye to nose ratio, the rounded as opposed to pointed features. Like I think we're hardwired to think certain things about certain things. That's why we take care of babies, because they're very round, proportionately large eyes. It's just an interesting thing that I'm not sure we've I think we're just kind of programmed to understand is a certain thing, and I'm not sure how much of that is nature or nurture, but it's all there.
Yeah.
It's all. a thing we consume on a regular basis. So, of Zorro, what do you think people should know that they don't know?
Hmm. I think people should know that there's very good evidence that Zorro was based on a real person. Um, at least elements of the story, Joaquin Murrieta, um, and that shows that Zorro is very much influenced by uh, uh, Mexican American and Latinx history, and that Zorro, as one of America's first superheroes, then that Latinx culture is part of what has given America it's one of its most popular forms of pop culture and entertainment, right? Um, and that again, it sort of underscores the notion about what makes America America is about its diversity, not about a sort of uh, white mythology, right? About its sources of history and culture. Um,
Are
and
very,
so,
very diverse.
yep.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that in studying history and working at a history museum, a couple of history museums, um, the more I learn about history, the more diverse our history is. And a lot of what is unknown has been very specifically erased.
Mhm.
And it's not that this history is unknown because, oh, someone didn't write that down. It was very intentionally written the way it was.
Mhm.
There's a lot of disenfranchisement in in the depictions of BIPOC people.
Mhm.
Um, but books like what you're writing really show the origins of why it's important to value history, to continue to keep searching and researching and finding the root of so many things. Like every single musical genre I've ever researched has Black roots,
Yeah.
like everything.
Yeah.
And it's a really beautiful thing. It gives me a kinship to absolutely everything in existence because it has that root. Um, and that's not to uh, take away from a understanding of how it exists in popular culture, but it's to kind of open up the fact that all of this is for everyone. Um, what do you think
Exactly. Yeah.
of
Yeah.
American culture? Like, what is American culture?
It's like the question of like what's American food, right? I
Yes.
mean, I think it's to me it's like the same question, and I'm like, you know, it's it's funny because it's like um to take the sort of metaphor farther, it's like if I say like hamburgers and hot dogs or whatever, it's like, come on, like,
I mean,
um,
brats and
right? Yeah, it's a,
like pates. I don't know. Like
right.
the
But yeah, if you were to say like bratwurst and right, uh, so like what is possible or what gives me hope about the notion of America is that somehow it can be greater than the sum of its parts,
mm-hmm,
right? So pizza, right, is an amazing American food, but yet, we look to Italy or like you like most of what passes as Mexican food in the United States is not, really authentic, Tex-Mex, right? But
yes.
man, I love me some Tex-Mex.
Yeah, it's
Like,
delicious.
or
Right.
you can go down the list, right? And
Yeah.
and so it's like there's a possibility to um somehow that these mixes, these mixtures can add something beautiful, right? And so when so what is American culture? It is not American without Latinx. It's not American without African. It's not American without, Asian. It's not American without all the LGBTQ. It's not American without all of those things that make it, and can make it more than the sum of its parts. And so that sort of sense of America at its foundation is fundamentally progressive in that it's striving towards something that it probably will never reach, but there is this insane hope and optimism towards that thing, and it goes wrong and it's crooked and right and
also the duality of us entirely working against the thing that we hold dear, and still saying that that's the value that we are working towards.
Right. Yeah, well said. That is like exactly right. It's like here's what we're working for, but then this is like the exact opposite thing that we're right.
But then you're working on something new in this time, and that's really interesting. So you're now embodying a young girl with siblings who is in an apocalypse. And I'm not sure if you noticed, but we're in an apocalypse. So
I know it's bad timing.
Why now? Why this? How this character? Like, tell me more about what you're writing now.
Yeah, so I've written the first volume of this novel. It's called Jade, Daughter of the Wasteland. It sounds insane when I say it out loud. Okay, but yeah, it's like talking very seriously about Zorro and pop culture, and then talking about a YA novel. But yeah, no, I mean this thing came out of a way to sort of sublimate my feelings of dread and anxiety into a story that I could control, right? And so, yeah, there's an apocalypse that happens. It is due to a virus, but don't worry, I don't spend a lot of time talking about the virus. So it's just in the after.
I really enjoy learning about the virus. Like, seriously, whenever I read a new zombie or post-apocalyptic thing, like, I want to know, like, is this some kind of derivation of like rabies or something, which is actually the way that this would actually happen.
I know, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can circle back. I'm just saying.
That's true. That's true. But yeah, it's just the agents and stuff I've approached were like, no, it's too soon. So we'll, but yeah, so I mean, I don't know if I'm not giving away anything about the story, but essentially I write about this protagonist, Jade, and her two siblings. And you know what? It was a way for me to think, spoiler, I have 3 children, and and I could begin to sort of imagine, right? And then it sort of took on a life of its own, right?
But you were inclusive, and isn't she a queer character?
So Jade is not, but her brother Samuel is.
Okay.
And then
why was that an important thing to include? Because
those people are in our world. Right. And like it's more a guy told me once, I was doing an interview with him, and he was talking about this notion of we were talking about how people talk about forced diversity, and to me the thing is just weird, right? Because it's like if it's more likely if you walk into a doctor's office that my doctor is going to be a woman or a person of color or anything than just a white guy with
reality of the world.
Right? And so like retroactively those people have always existed too, right? And so like but anyway, like, so for me it was just like, well, it just has become increasingly important for me as a writer to challenge myself and to say, sure, we all write out of our own experiences, but those experiences are also searching for empathy, where we're searching for understanding, where we're searching for like, actually, you know, when I'm writing about this love story, um, I feel those feelings, and it doesn't really, like, that person's potentially uh, uh, sexual orientation doesn't change those human experiences that are happening.
Yeah.
Right.
So you talk
um,
about the commonality of experiencing love.
right.
Now, there are specific
Sure.
nuances and there are specific things whenever socially that happen, whenever it's a same sex relationship. But the experience of love, of attraction, of interest is universal. And
Yeah.
so it sounds like what you're doing is talking to the universality and also the commonality of the fact that we live in a diverse world.
Yeah.
Even though white male is the shorthand for people, it's not the entirety of any existence that we actually have.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we got to talk about in writing Zorro, is that white male, you start saying it, you don't have to. In fact, I don't think that Harry Potter was ever described as a race.
Mhm.
But the assumption was very easily that he was a white male.
Yeah.
And the same thing with Hermione. And whenever they started making her a person of color in later depictions, people lost their minds.
I know, right?
Yeah, and Rue in Hunger Games.
Yeah.
And she was said to be black in it. They just skipped over that part, you know.
Right. Right.
But race is absolutely a thing that you cannot be a nerd and be racist.
Mhm.
It just doesn't work. It You can try real hard, you can fail at, but you are missing the point. You're not understanding what the purpose and the what you were supposed to get out of this culture, of the understanding, of the inclusion, of the history. um, and that's a really vital thing that I think that the East Baton Rouge Parish Library does really well with their annual Comic Cons and the kinds of things that they put on, is explaining that these things are not separate, that you cannot take away social issues and still speak honestly about our popular culture, about comic books, about cartoons. And so, you know, it may seem kind of juvenile, it may seem like, oh, you might be too old for this, but the allegories that are told are based on historic narratives. And the way that we are to understand this in a broad way is to become more sensitive to our differences.
Yeah.
But I it's why I love studying these things. It's because I see myself and reflected in those kinds of stories. But I know that I was never the target audience. I was not the one, you know, they didn't make, you know, Naruto or Dragon Ball Z thinking that a black teenage girl was going to be watching it. Um, so I'm glad that these things exist and that they're a lot more available and open in the broad understanding of who's playing and who's interested, you know. And another thing that I really like is that, you know, D&D making a hard comeback.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And Magic the Gathering, you know, Pokemon. My mother-in-law is like playing Pokemon Go now, you know. Like, who would have thought?
Yeah.
It's I mean, it's great commercialism, right? And we could absolutely talk about like the monetizing of children's love and
Right.
their interests,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the action figures and the toys and the, you know. But we can also talk about being surrounded by these things you love while you're watching a thing that celebrates this thing you love. You know, what if
Yeah.
and tell me more about what you did on Saturday mornings.
Well, I would wake up before it was light, and I would sort of pad down the stairs, and my three sisters were still asleep, and my parents were, and I would pop in a couple of Eggo waffles and pour my syrup on it, and then go out and hope that the religious programming was over, and then that the cartoons were started, and I would sit there, and then I would hear, a lot of times it seems like the Looney Tunes cartoons would come on early, and I would hear that sort of bowstring, and then the sort of WB logo, right?
Yeah.
And as the in the dark room, as the light would come on, and there's a sense of comfort there, like, because Looney Tunes is on, and it's all of what you were just saying, like that moment was brought to you by Kellogg's cereal or whatever.
Sure.
But but yet it was greater than just that. And here's the thing, like, one of the things that I've seen in both Zorro and in the Speedy Gonzales is the sense of, like, the sponsors and the creators might have an agenda, and that agenda might be money making, but yet audiences are there to metabolize that, and they make it they take what they need out of it, right? Mm-hmm. And just as and so just like a popular saint, for instance, right? There's a sense of, like, that's pushed out for a certain purpose and reason, but the devotion takes on a life of its own, and it can be powerful, right? And so with Zorro and with Speedy Gonzales, especially Latinx audiences have metabolized it and made those characters their own, right? Despite whatever kind of intent, despite the latent racism that might be there or whatever. And so that's the beauty, I think, of that situation is the kind of agency that the audience has in making a character their own, making it a hero or authentic icon, and molding it and shaping it to their own.
I think that's a beautiful sentiment to end on. I mean, you kind of tied up everything in a nice bow of what we were talking about. Bringing in religious iconography, bringing in popular culture, bringing in all of the things that we take from our world that we love, and the way that we're able to synthesize that in our experiences to bring our self-joy, to bring fulfillment to our lives, to understand on whatever new level. And now, people have the 2-screen experience, and they're, playing the video game about the comic book character that they're watching, and they're, but it's that same experience of, how do I transport myself into the world that I need, that I want, that I can have a richer experience in what I have in my everyday existence.
Oh.
And so, well, that was really cool. This was
a
great conversation. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you for having me and talking to me. This is awesome. Love it.
Me too. Anytime.
Thank you for watching this presentation of the virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival. Please visit our official bookseller, Cavalier House Books, and receive 20% off all featured festival titles through the end of the year. A special thank you to our festival sponsors. The Louisiana Book Festival will return on October 29th, 2022.